Everyone, my name is Ala Tafalla, and I'm going to be presenting this work that I did along with Lucy Simcoe and both of our advisors, Alexandra Berdas and Yoshi Kohno, on the defensive practices of political activists during the 2018-2019 political revolution in Sudan. In the past decade, there has been a number of protest movements advocating for human rights and political change around the world. In 2011, the series of protests that swept through the Middle East and North Africa, known as Arab Spring, became some of the first political movements to leverage the power of social media as an organizational tool. We believe that political activism is important to study because of its historic role in bringing about increased justice and equity in the world, and because it can involve regular people directly facing the powerful nation-state adversary. In this paper, we study the Sudanese revolution, which erupted at the end of 2018 and led to a transitional civilian military government that is currently in rule. Here, we provide more background information on the Sudanese revolution and the timeline of events leading to that. In December of 2018, anti-government protests erupted in Adbara. Within days, demonstrations were held in most cities around the country, and an umbrella organization called the Sudanese Professionals Association emerged as a leader of the movement at the time. Following that, the movement evolved to become more organized and structured, with neighborhood resistance committees being formed. During that time, there has been occasional social media blockades where access to certain apps and services was curtailed. This continued up to the deposition of the president in April, and a peaceful sit-in followed where people gathered in a massive protest scene in front of the military headquarters. In June of 2019, there was a complete internet blackout that continued for more than a month before the transitional civilian military government was formed. With this backdrop information, we formulate the following research questions. We first wanted to know what threats were the activists facing. We can't know exactly what the government was capable of or what they did in some cases, but it is important to understand the activists' threat models since those shaped their practices. Second, we wanted to know about how they protected themselves, whether their practices felt sufficient, and the challenges they encountered with technology. And finally, we wanted to know how activists adopted new technologies, behaviors, or mental models, and how that knowledge spread within the community. Stepping back, we also use the answers to these questions to draw lessons for the future security and privacy researchers and technologists about the political and societal factors that influenced activists' technology use and about certain tensions or design principles that arise from our findings. To answer these questions, we decided to conduct semi-structured interviews. We first received IRB approval for our study at both institutions. Because this is a sensitive and potentially dangerous topic for participants, we thought carefully about how to best protect participants. Our guiding principles were that we should not collect or store more personal information than we needed, and that we should follow participants' leads with respect to what they were comfortable sharing, what technology they wanted to use, and what information they wanted to give about themselves. We recruited 13 participants. Our interviews were remote, and most of our participants agreed on being recorded and preferred audio-only calls over video. 5 interviews were in Arabic and 8 were in English. We recorded, translated, and transcribed all interviews. We then developed a qualitative codebook through an iterative coding process. 2 researchers then applied the codebook to each interview. While there are some ethical concerns on whether the publication of these results could harm the efforts of future activists, we argue that it is unreasonable to expect that all future activists will be technically sophisticated. However, it is reasonable to expect that nation-states will have technical sophistication. Thus, we believe that while the findings in this paper can contribute to the creation of technologies to empower future activists, we do not believe that our findings go beyond what a sophisticated nation-state could deduce. To understand more about why activists adopted the security practices and behaviors that they did, in this slide we present the most common threats that activists faced and what were their security goals. The threat of arrest and physical device seizure was the most common threat experienced by those we talked to. Once arrested, phones were confiscated and activists were forced to unlock their phones and sometimes forced to log into their social media accounts. An arrest of one person could be a trigger for a chain of arrests in that person's network. The second threat is the threat of electronic or physical surveillance. Most participants believed that regular phone calls and SMS messages were monitored due to the control that the government has over the telecommunications infrastructure and companies. The third threat was the threat of misinformation and propaganda. Online misinformation was rampant during the revolution, and it usually spread from online accounts known as electronic chickens. And it included fake news, false reports about deaths at protests or false protest times and locations. The fourth threat that activists faced was the threat of censorship or disrupted access to social media apps and services or the internet. Activists also had a number of security goals in place given the threats they faced. The first goal was to provide plausible deniability during protests and upon arrest. Second, they wanted to ensure the security of their online communications and prevent misinformation. Third, they wanted to stay secure from being physically targeted. And finally, they wanted to ensure the availability and security of their communications during two important phases, the social media blockade and the internet blackout. In the next few slides, we will go through the security practices and behaviors that activists adopted in order to achieve these goals. Manual message deletion was among the most popular practices that activists adopted to sanitize their devices and hence provide plausible deniability upon arrest. People deleted messages on their phones before going to protests and expected others in their group to do the same. They also sanitized their online presence and information that would be available in their online accounts. So activists decided that because they would be forced to give up their passcodes upon arrest, the best course of action was to simply delete any messages from other activists. In this second quote here, the participant mentions that the phone is 100% sanitized before the protest time. When trying to look at the political influence that shaped the activists' practices of message deletion, we find that one factor is that the right to privacy is defined differently around the world, and it affects what technology someone is going to use or not use to protect themselves. This first quote is from one of the participants recounting their arrest. They're talking about how the police forced them to unlock their phone, but they were still confident that they wrote down the passcode for them, and it worked. They were never able to figure out who that person really was. In the US, domestic arrestees are protected by the Fifth Amendment from being compelled to give a passcode. Android and iOS support American users by providing a quick way to force passcode authentication over biometric authentication. But users in Sudan or any other country where the right to privacy upon arrest is defined differently are not. Another political influence is that participants believed that the Sudanese government could conduct mass surveillance, and that SMS in particular was unsafe due to being unencrypted. So users' beliefs about what their government can do both legally and practically to surveil them is a driving factor of adoption or non-adoption. There were additional societal influences impacting activists' adoption choices. For example, group adoption was a challenge. Participants told us that digital and security literacy of others in the group was a barrier to app adoption. This quote is about wanting to communicate with someone on a platform that the other person already knows because you can trust that they'll actually use it properly as opposed to a new application or technology. Other practices for phone sanitization do appear in the paper. Furthermore, and to provide plausible deniability upon arrest, activists had a number of strategies for data hiding. More details about these practices can also be found on our paper. To ensure the security of their online communications, activists used foreign numbers as a second factor of authentication. Participants felt safer with a second factor number outside the US, and this quote is from someone in particular who felt safer with a number from a country whose government did not support the outgoing Sudanese government. So there were three ways that participants configured two-factor authentication using a foreign number. First, if they had a friend, family member, or someone else outside of the country, that person might be able to add their number onto the activists' online social media accounts. Second, some created fake US numbers online through a phone service in an app provider, thinking that this would provide privacy by not going through the Sudanese telephone network but relying on the security of the app provider and depending on the internet availability. And the third strategy was obtaining a foreign SIM card and using it on roaming. Participants felt that network traffic in Sudan that went through a foreign SIM would be safer than the same traffic going through a Sudanese SIM card. Though it depends on technical and political specifics, we are unsure whether the foreign SIM gave them the privacy and security guarantees that they thought they had. So moving on from the mechanics of how this happened and the technical threat models, let's think about why. First, international sanctions prevent the use of local numbers for authentication on Twitter and similar social media platforms. For example, this participant says, especially at that time because in Sudan, Twitter does not have verification for Sudanese numbers. So we think it is important to consider what features and technologies are available in a region in case of sanctions or restrictions, because those can shape strategies and behaviors. Another political factor in this threat model is the degree of legal control and access that governments have over telecommunication infrastructure and companies. In addition, the motivations and capabilities of foreign governments that might be helping the adversary influences the choice of foreign number for authentication. For example, in the bottom quote here, the participant stresses that the foreign number used has to be something in Europe. We also find that a societal characteristic of the Sudanese community, which is the robust network of the Sudanese diaspora, enabled two-factor authentication using a foreign number for activists in the ground. Most of our participants had friends or family abroad who could enable this kind of SMS authentication. To prevent online misinformation, activists relied on a number of manual heuristics searching through unknown online profiles to identify patterns of fake news or suspicious handles. For example, one participant here explains in detail one of their heuristics. In addition, the Sudanese diaspora formed a content moderation team on social media, taking shifts and reporting and questioning suspicious online accounts. This ad hoc organically crowdsourced and effective content moderation team may suggest that crowdsourcing and self-moderation can be effective within activist communities. We also know that establishing trusted sources was of utmost importance to prevent online misinformation. Activists built networks of contacts to enable them to get news from a trusted first-hand source, with the root source of trust being an in-person meeting. This network was sometimes multiple layers deep so that it would be harder for an adversarial observer to trace through the network between the sources and the destination. Activists had different strategies in place to maintain physical security, things like camouflaging their activities, planning escape routes, and surveying the area. There was also a public discourse on best protest practices in terms of what color of clothes to wear and how to protest in groups or pairs, and knowing when to run. During the internet blackout, most people didn't have internet access, and this prevented people from accessing the internet and talking over encrypted messaging apps. So mesh networking apps are an example of a strategy that did not work for participants. This quote is talking about an app called FireChat that a few participants mentioned, but they said it didn't work for them, so this person started to develop their own mesh networking app to fill the gap. Participants explained why the mesh networking apps they tried to use didn't work for them. One issue was usability and functionality. As you can see in this quote, when the participant says people couldn't make it work, it didn't even join those who were in close proximity to each other. Moreover, mesh networking chat applications suffer from the problem of group adoption. They're not useful until reaching a critical mass of users, and until then, users decide not to adopt them, preventing a critical mass. One solution might be to suggest that people should pre-download mesh networking apps. Another solution might be that popular messaging apps should add support for mesh networking capabilities. However, we acknowledge that this suggestion might be in tension with the needs of other groups who could prefer the use of custom-built apps that only they have access to, while for others it may be better to use popular everyday apps like WhatsApp. The activists we talked with did not have the technology they needed to solve this problem of no internet access, and it was something that their technology was less easily adapted to. To ensure the availability of communications, most participants turned to SMS and telephone calls, being careful to obfuscate what they were saying or who they were talking to. Those who had internet at home used it to talk to those outside Sudan and to pass messages and news to and from their community. Activists also used paper pamphlets and graffiti to get out the word about the time and date of protests. In conclusion, we find that it is difficult to generalize design recommendations, things like mesh networking in mainstream apps, alternative authentication methods, or data sanitization and deletion on trigger, as they may be in tension with the needs and recommendations for other user groups. However, we recommend that researchers and technology designers Studying user practices asks questions about the geopolitical context, things like the right to privacy, the power held by authorities, and government control over telecommunications infrastructure, but also whether the country has any history of internet censorship and blackouts and how international politics and sanctions influence technology access in that country. In addition, we also think it is important to ask questions about the characteristics of the users, things like baseline digital literacy, knowledge sharing, and trust within the community, and what is the common security knowledge disseminated among these communities. Thank you.